Good evening, everyone. We'll get rolling in just a second. Quick audio check. Perfect. In comes the flood. Quick audio check. We'll get rolling in about 30 seconds. Perfect. Well, without further ado, good evening, all. 6 p.m. on the West Coast, 9 p.m. on the East Coast. We've done some later sessions to help make sure that all the content can get out there, and this will also be available on demand afterwards if you know the secret password. It is some fantastic new content for this evening, and quite frankly, with all the courses that our co-speaker and I have been doing lately, crisscrossing the country, this is the one that seems to be coming up the most. What the heck is going on with landlords? Why are banks being difficult with tiny little typeface fonts in something called a lease agreement that suddenly can have the impact of hundreds of thousands of dollars in the dental office lease negotiations? My partner in crime here, Mr. Bill Henderson, is connecting at a couple of audio difficulties, should be on here momentarily. Bill, can you hear us? Can you see us?
I can see you and hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but that's okay because, as my wife reminds me all the time, I've got a great face for radio.
You just beat me to that joke. I was going to say exactly the same thing. I will continue to work to connect via Zoom, but until then, do you want to lead off or do you want me to? And you can just run the slides for me.
I'm good to go. I'm good to go.
Okay, you go ahead. I'll keep working on a better connection here.
No troubles at all. So let's jump right in, guys. This is a big piece. All new content, really digging into demolitions, relocations, how we fix it, what the impact is directly to your financials, some actual pro forma examples. And again, the co-speaker tonight is truly incredible. I'll introduce him in just a moment. But what is the purpose, process, and payoff for this evening? First of all, what the heck is going on in 2024? What does now impact the value of your clinic? Way back when it was 1 times earnings, maybe more. Now it's this crazy EBITDA, right? And suddenly, thanks to all the ramping up of corporate buyers, suddenly now no two practices are alike. So what does that mean? Now, fast forward, what impact does the lease have in the practice valuation? That can be a bigger challenge because suddenly now we need to, and I ask all of you on the selling side to take off the selling hat for a second, take off the dental hat for a second, and look at your lease and your practice through the eyes of the buyer. And that should help sort of shape now what ultimately your buyer is going to be looking for. Let that be term, predictability, continuity, decrease in risk, etc. Right? For you at your end of your career, hey, it's been fine. My landlord's good. My landlord said they're not going to do anything. But for a buyer, suddenly paying $1.5 million for $1 million producing practice, well, hey, I need to make sure that I'm not going to get stuck between a rock and a hard place. So we're going to go through 3 items, some examples of what to look for within your lease for those of you following along. There's going to be a couple $100,000 traps hidden in your lease that we're going to touch on and expose. And Bill, I can now see you, and I'll hold back on the face for radio comments. Oh, now I can't hear you, Bill. So as we get Bill connected, we'll also dig through the lease terms, right? And also how to structure them properly as we go through. Don't have you yet, Bill. So for those, I think I got you now.
Can you hear me now?
I got you. 10 over 10.
Okay.
So
finally,
welcome. For those of you that have not joined one of our CE courses in the past. Welcome. We are the only healthcare specialized tenant advisory and lease negotiation firm of our kind. It's our 30th year in business. It is truly remarkable since a bunch of doctors partnered with some real estate experts back in 1994. And since then, we're well over 12,000 dental and medical office leases negotiated. Obviously, we've got attorneys on staff. We have some incredible lease negotiators. We have some that used to work on the landlord side. We've got an incredible team that is just doing this all day, every day, dental office lease negotiations, dealing with demos, relos, etc. So again, privileged to share what we've learned, what we've seen, and more importantly, what landlords are doing now. Myself, as one of your humble speakers tonight, as the owner and president of Cirrus Consulting Group, it is a privilege to help business owners, one business owner to another, help to make sure that you can focus on what you do well every single day, which is practice great clinical care. And how do we help take all the stress and bang your head against the wall dealing with landlords 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday, dealing with lease renewals, expansions, relocations, etc. More importantly, Bill Henderson, right? Arguably one of the best talents for dental office lease negotiations throughout the country, was a key part of the Tier 3 integration into Henry Schein Canada. And, again, he's got a heck of a history about trying to sell his wife's practice and suddenly realizing maybe there's a better way. Bill is incredibly candid. Bill is one that really does help make sure that it does maximize the practice sale value, and just, posting it on some dental school's website versus having someone to navigate these intricacies is completely different. So it is my privilege to welcome Bill onto our course. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. I'm here purely out of vested self-interest. As somebody who makes his living selling, appraising, and more importantly, selling dental practices, the number one issue I and my colleagues have is lease issues when we're trying to get a practice sold. So anything I can do to help educate people at this stage is merely going to make my life much easier later.
Perfect. And that's a good point. Bill and I have had the privilege of doing a number of these. What we have here is a quick little poll. So help to shape the content a little bit tonight. You'll see a couple of poll questions come up. Do you own or do you lease your space? If so, what best describes your current situation? I'm opening, I'm acquiring, I'm transitioning or selling, I'm going to stay put, right? Or none of the above. When does that lease expire? That really does predicate the planning. Bill's going to share anywhere from 10 to 15 years out is the ideal time to start creating the roadmap for your eventual sale. Bill and I had the privilege to do a great presentation with Andrea Chan, one of the managing partners of MNP, the great accounting firm, and she's now a board member. And we did the financial trifectas a few times and really talking about how to properly take out those bad assets from the practice corp, how to help to make sure that you minimize your tax liability upon sale are key. And then for those of you thinking to start or buy a practice are great. Looks like 36% are looking to buy, just to give you a sense of buyers and sellers. And certainly looks like a lot of the leases are coming due, and about 33% Bill own their own building, just for comparison purposes.
Right.
Perfect. And about 38% planning to sell in the next 5 years or less. And one planning to acquire, and another 19% looking to opening or potentially relocate. All right, perfect. So let's jump in. So just to cover a couple of key pieces before we get into the financial components. We're going to get into some of the practical pieces of what is and may be in your lease today. And then Bill's going to touch on if that same language is in your lease today, as is upon the time of practice appraisal or practice sale, what is the financial impact, and what is some of the less than good news to prepare yourself for now. So the lease, what the heck is this thing? Why is it so important? What's in there? Well, first of all, if you haven't built out a clinic recently, it is unbelievably expensive complicated, challenging, and much more difficult than it was 5 years ago, than it was 5 years prior, than it was 5 years prior to that. So with that being said, the lease either becomes a rock solid concrete foundation or a crumbling shell that could end up costing tens of thousands of dollars down the line. Of course, as you wake up in the morning and you say, Bill, you know what? I really like that strip mall across the street. I'd love to move over there before I sell it, right? Can create a Herculean task. And especially if it's later in your career, right, might not give you the return you're hoping for in comparison to that significant $1 million plus build out when you factor in equipment and current build out costs. And most importantly, as we're focusing on today, the impact the lease has on the practice sale. So just a couple of components that we want to focus on. First of all is term. Term is one that I can't tell you how often the doctors that we speak to every day think, Bill, you know what? I'm just about to, I'm winding down. I only think I'm going to be in the business for another couple of years. And you know what? Maybe I'm just going to wind my lease down to be month to month. Bill now has shivers going down his spine because now looking at it through the buyer's side, suddenly now what is the likelihood that that buyer is going to be able to have the ability to stay in that space over the long term? That becomes the challenge. So it's so important to take off your seller's hat and start thinking about it for the long-term viability of the clinic, not just about you and your exit. How do we make sure that we give a yellow brick road for that buyer? How do we make sure that there's, again, the likelihood that they can come in for the next 10, 15, 20 years, turn the key, patients arrive, and they can pay for the rent and, more importantly, the $1.5 million loan to buy your $1 million producing practice today. So term becomes very important. The second part of that within term is so many doctors think with a false sense of security that, Bill, I've got 15 years left on my lease. I've got a 15-year lease. Well, do you, or is it more of the I've got a 5-year term and 2 5-year options? That is very different for one of a few reasons. Number one is landlords realize, and landlords build in language into your lease that basically states that if in the event that you do not give notice in writing via carrier pigeon, via registered mail, when the sun is aligned with Mercury to be delivered by such and such a date, or the remaining 2 5-year options become null and void. So the big difference between term and options is options are if you do happen to miss those, and don't assume your landlord is going to proactively remind you of these, those you can go from thinking, I've got another 10 years to suddenly now I'm a month-to-month tenant. So term, and lots of it, especially with the high producing practices, creates now the long-term stability and predictability that your buyer can come in and have a place to work. Again, now ask yourself, how much is your clinic worth if, hypothetically, right, the landlord took away your keys? The second and third that we'll touch on is demolition and relocation, and I'll go through those shortly. Some of the key components now as part of the exercise here is to make sure you put these into your phone tonight. Number one is, when does your lease expire? Put that into your phone. That's not 15 years. That's probably the balance of your current 5-year renewal term. Number two, what is your option to renew deadline date? That could be 3 months prior to expiry, 6 or 12 months. The landlords want as much time as possible to say, hey, let me know if you don't want to stay, so I can put up a for lease sign. I can show people the premises so I'm not stuck, right, with a vacant premises. That's the purpose of it. However, right, in many cases, the landlords have reached out to doctors to say, you want to stay? We didn't hear from you. You didn't exercise your option. You're currently month to month. Well, here's our new standard form lease. Right? And suddenly then it creates a significant worse situation. Number three, right? When do you plan to transition and sell? Number four, are your options transferable? This is one we did recently with Tier 3. One of the great merger and acquisition attorneys, Michael Kuttner, had shared this story. This was an example of a client of his that needed to sell their clinic. They had 2 years left on the lease and they had 2 5-year options. Bill, I've got 12 years, I'm good. Unfortunately, within the language of the options to renew, it specifically stated that they were personal to the selling doctor. Therefore, the doctor had 2 years. The doctor could renew for another 5 years, but the buyer could not. So, right, they reached out to try to transfer the options. Well, lo and behold, the landlord said no. Not only did the landlord said no after all the pushing and prodding, etc., the landlord said, look, the only way I'm going to do it is I want to check. I know how much you're selling your practice for. I want to check for $100,000 just to transfer those 2 5-year options, and therefore facilitating roughly 12 years for that buyer to get a 12-year term from the bank. So, other components, and we'll spend more time touching on those. Are you personally liable? Are you liable even after you sell your clinic? Most sellers are shocked to realize that, Bill, what do you mean? This, hey, you got me this great buyer, fantastic, but hey, I'm not backloading them. I don't want to be liable for them if they don't pay the rent. And how long am I going to be liable for? In many cases, as long as that lease continues to renew, it could be indefinitely. Right? What about relocation? What about demolition? So rate the state of your estate. For those of you that own roughly 32%, right? Is it you? Is it your corporation? Is it your practice? Is it your corporation? Who owns which? Are you paying yourself rent today? Right? Are you tracking building expenses, office expenses? Have you reviewed that with your accountant lately to ensure that you're not overpaying or underpaying? And then from that perspective as well, right? Do you have a lease separating those two entities? And then ultimately, we do see many doctors either that are paying 1.5 million and suddenly don't want to pay another 2 million for the real estate. They'd rather have the opportunity to buy the clinic, right? Pay some of that debt off, and then after 10 years, have a right to purchase, a right to offer, etc. So again, do you want to potentially keep the building as a passive form of income going into your retirement? 7 key things. We'll touch on the big 3 in terms of preparing yourself for sale. Death and disability, as a quick side note, so important to help ensure that, heaven forbid, if anything happens to you, or like my godfather, took the wrong divot towards rotator cuff, couldn't practice dentistry again at the early age of 52. So death and disability is a fantastic clause for you buyers, new builds, or even mid-career doctors, right? It's basically a termination right. Think about it like a life insurance policy that doesn't cost you a penny. Death and disability, there was a devastating example north of the city who had built a beautiful 6-operatory practice. 3 weeks prior to the grand opening, the poor doctor died of a massive heart attack. Fully built out clinic, no doctor, no patients, right? We don't need Bill to do the practice analysis to realize how much that practice is worth. In actuality, it was 0, actually less than 0, because the life insurance went to cover the bank loan for the practice loan. Suddenly now the doctor and the spouse, in this case, in their estate, was now bound to the lease. And the landlord went back to the spouse and said, unfortunately, Mrs. Smith, you're now responsible for the roughly $9,000 a month, increasing at 4% per year for the remaining 9.5 years on the lease. So how do we help to prevent ourselves from some of these components? Why does a company like ours even exist? Well, it exists because of how much the lease can take Bill's value from 1.9 down dramatically with just some of these black and white typeface in a lease that you might have signed back in 1986. So what are some of these clauses? Well, relocation clause, what the heck is it? Relocation at a very high level is the ability that the landlord can support who they want to bend over backwards for, which is typically their large anchor tenants. The landlord wants the right. They are the lord of the land. They want the right to be able to choose and be able to expand and move things around like little Lego blocks in their stacking plan to appease the tenants that are looking for more space and want to get bigger and bigger. So ultimately, the landlord has the right to move you to any other location in the mall, or perhaps even to any other building the landlord owns throughout the province at little to no notice. So some of the landlords' preferred language is this: the landlord may at any time upon 60 days notice relocate the premise, reasonably comparable size, right? So number one. So that's the typical landlord's language. What we would want to add here is that lights off to lights on. The issues here is 60 days notice. What do you do, right? The landlord suddenly can tell you in 60 days, but they have no responsibility to be up and running by the time that that's open. So having the ability to make sure that you close on a Friday, right? You get the professional movers at Henry Schein to move the chairs because you can't pick up your 8X chair from the back, you'll break the motor, right? To move yourself down the hallway and then be up and running, right? That's the first. The second big issue here is that typically the premise relocated, right? Except it'll be adjusted higher or lower than the square footage you have today. But if it's a different shape, if suddenly you're a pie shape pattern, right, you're not going to be able to fit in the same 4 or 5 operatories. You might only get 2 or 3 now. Suddenly less operatories, more production, bigger space, more rent, right, can be a significant issue. The landlord can reimburse the tenant for reasonable costs and expense, right? But typically not any loss of profits. And look, even if you're shut down for a month, 2 months, 3 months, it's not even the lack of production that concerns me. It's the patient attrition, which can be upwards of 8+% per month that go down the street and they don't come back, right? So from this perspective, again, just some of these clauses, it basically states that you must execute it. If not, the lease is terminated. You can do no claim, right? There's no loss or interruption of business that you can do. It is purely of the landlord's discretion to move you at any time. I read one the other day. It stated that the landlord was going to cover 100% of the relocation costs up to a maximum of 2 months of rent. And to build out a clause now, to build out a new dental clinic, Bill, runs you what per square foot these days?
We're working with estimates depending upon where in the country, anywhere from $300 plus HST per square foot up to $350. So, you know, if you've got a 1,500 square foot practice for 4 ops, you're looking at $400, about $500,000 when all is said and done. If you've got more than 4 ops or gets pushed into a much larger space, costs could go up from there. And that's without buying any new equipment.
So as we get into those, relocation, while you might think, you know what, if the landlord really wants to move me, so be it, right? But the reality is when you actually think of the mechanics and the steps involved, right? God knows the landlord who has never done a dental office build before, right? It is ripe for issues, concerns, and beyond. Demolition clause, the big D. So what does that really mean for us? Well, as you look throughout, as I was in Vancouver last week, as I was all over Toronto and Ontario this week, demolition clause is certainly everywhere. It's probably in over 55% of leases we see throughout the major urban centers and beyond. Why is it here? Well, the landlord wants the control. The landlord has probably had at least one major incident or knows someone that has. And luckily, we've helped protect many tenants by securing a while back a 10-year term, 2 5-year options. And now suddenly the landlord's about to get a $44 million check to say, hey, right, well, we're going to build a condo here. If there is a tenant with a strong lease, right, that could be, recently we helped a client get a payout of over $1.1 million just to not execute their 2 5-year options because of the strength of the lease. Went out and bought a building down the street. It was beautiful. So it's so important if this section is in your lease or not. At a high level, What it allows a landlord to do is that even if it intends to demolish or materially alter the project, they then have the right, with as little as 180 days notice, or sometimes even less, to terminate your lease, giving you written notice. That could be 1 year into a 10-year term. It could be just the day after you've built out your new clinic, or it could be at the end of a very long career that suddenly now, as there was just a terrible example of a doctor that had a great relationship with their landlord. The landlord came in, it was in a strata, funny enough, right? The landlord came in and said, oh, here's a new standard form lease. My lawyer wanted me to update the leases, just sign here. The doctor signed it in between patients, didn't look on the second and third page, and only found out that he has a demolition clause when he just got his 6 months notice 2 weeks ago. So now this doctor, late 50s, doesn't want to give up, right? Now has to go through the full redevelopment because of the fact that this was slid into the lease. So they've got the ability, and there's no compensation of any kind. And hey, they maybe will do a straight line amortization for any of the leasehold improvements or tenant improvements. But again, everything's probably depreciated down to pretty much nothing. So one little clause and the rug completely gets pulled out from under you. Or now, looking at it from the buyer's side, they've just paid you 1.5 million. Suddenly now, whoops, I've got to go find another space somewhere else and incur whatever expenses that may be. So cost $300 per square foot, as Bill mentioned, right, can impact hundreds of thousands of dollars. In the essence of time, the last one is the assignment. This is what Bill typically flips to first in the analysis of the lease as part of the practice valuation. And this is another big one. Doctors who are in a leasing situation today, the 64% of you, right, must have the landlord's prior written consent before you can sell your clinic. Because typically the two conditions of sale are, right, the buyer getting financing and the seller, right, buying, getting financing, and the successful assignment of the lease from the transferor, the seller, right, to the transferee, basically transferring on that lease from one to the other. What we're seeing a lot more of now is the landlords wanting the termination right, meaning that in the second red section here, that the landlord now, when you ask them to sell, suddenly the landlord can say, yes, no problems, right? Dr. Henderson, fantastic. You're approved. Number two, no, I don't like the cut of Dr. Henderson's jib. Or three, you know what? I'm actually, now that I know you want to sell, move on, etc., option three, I'm going to terminate this lease agreement on the proposed date of closing your sale, March 1st. So this is becoming more common, and it's a landlord's termination right to, again, if you want to transfer, the landlord says, look, right, on the next clause, they can increase rent, or at the bottom, they can even ask for a percentage of your practice sale proceeds. So the landlord says, well, hey, prove me wrong. What's the value of your clinic without my space? Right? Without my keys. It's my foot traffic, not the blood, sweat, and tears and stress and headaches that you've done in your clinic over the past 10, 20, 30 plus years. And then lastly, at the very bottom is that, right, you shall remain liable for the failure of the future tenant or any of its assignees in the future for every single covenant in this lease. So one little point, one cost of the mistake, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. A personal client of mine wrote a great Google review the other day. She said, look, my lease prevented me from selling my clinic 3 separate times. Once to her partner, once to an associate, right? And then once to potentially to a DSO. The landlord said no every single time. So at 74 years of age, she hired us. We were able to move her about 10 minutes north, and we were able to cover luckily get the future landlord, to cover almost the entire cost of the building. That doesn't happen every day. But imagine being 74 years of age and being forced to go through a full relocation, all because the landlord wanted to demolish or refuse to assign the lease. So on that note, as I pass it to Bill, we're going to jump into the financial components right on time. What I wanted to do here was a quick component. So as we pass to Bill, and Bill, you can either control my screen or I can move it along for you. But
I would love to control your screen and many other aspects of you, Eric. But
well, what we'll do as we pass to Bill is, in appreciation for everyone's time, if you're nervous about what's in your lease, if you're nervous about the terms, or more importantly, if you want to know, again, of the 13,000 of them have we done it in your building? Have we been able to do a blackout clause, or have we been able to extend the term of the lease? And therefore, we've got some precedents and some better opportunities within the space today. In addition to that, right, if you're concerned about relocation, demolitions, or what other successes we've had with the landlord, highly suggest that we have a look at your lease, and also help to provide you some proactive reminders upon your eventual next option to renew deadline. Also, for tier 3, if you are interested in your current practice values, marketing trends, etc., there's a little section at the bottom as well. I'll keep that open, and I will, again, look forward to speaking to hopefully each and every one of you. Look, you're not alone in all of this. Relos, demos, etc. are a huge impact and are getting worse. They are becoming more common. We were in at RBC's headquarters the other day. I was with TD. I was on a national call with BMO today, right? It's become so important that we help to educate the importance of it. And then more importantly, how do we help to make sure that we have as much predictability and continuity across the board? So on that note, I will pass it over to the esteemed one and only Mr. Bill Henderson.
Thank you very much, Eric. And apologies to everybody. I was having technical problems at the beginning, and we may see if those persist now, because Eric, how am I going to advance slides on my own here?
So you've got two. You can either request control, or even better, I think I can assign it to you directly.
If you can do that, click to start the mouse. You are controlling Eric. Oh, we're good. We're good to go. Okay, perfect. So we've got basically, if I recall correctly, Eric, 3 types of people in the audience. There are people who own a practice and are in leased space. There are people who own a practice and own the building they're in. And there are people looking to buy a practice. Is that right?
Correct.
So the real big picture comment here for everybody is, if you own a practice and you own the building you're in great shape. The slides are auto advancing on me. There we go. You will, when you go to sell, that immediately makes your practice more valuable than somebody who's in lease space. And frankly, it does whether you're going to sell the premises with the practice or not, because you're able to structure a lease for the buyer of your practice that will be what all of the buyers on this call want. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit to the buyers about what to look out for, and to those of you who own a practice. For everybody, I'm going to talk about how your practice is valued pretty quickly, because I don't want to waste everyone's time. And then I'm going to go over some of the things Eric just showed you, but talk in more specifics about what it does to the value of your practice, and what you can do, hopefully, to mitigate that. So at some point in the past, some of you have probably seen something that looks like this in a practice valuation. It shows a goodwill number, and then a sum of all of the hard assets in the practice, clinical equipment, admin equipment, software, leasehold improvements, and somebody's totaled them up to come up with a practice value. If you see that in an appraisal, it is complete garbage. You'll see it as a schedule in one of ours, but it's not how anybody is valuing practices intelligently anymore. And the reason is simple. The buyers on the call cannot repay their bank loan with the dental chair and Op2. So whether it's a 35-year-old Pelton and Crane chairman chair valued at $2,500 or a brand new Sirona chair valued at $10,000, that doesn't help them repay the bank loan. Their ability to treat patients in the chair does. Nor can the sterilizer in the Steri Center allow them to fund their next vacation or their kids' schooling. So what drives the value of a practice today is this thing called EBITDA, which is a simple acronym for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's still a mouthful. So think of it as just the cash coming out of the business before taxes and any loan repayment. I'm going to walk you through a simplistic example, and they get a lot more complicated than this, but hopefully this will sort of give everyone a good sense of what's going on. All of you will be getting annually from your accountant something called an income statement or a statement of profit and loss. It's in that usually 5 to 10 page deck of financial statements you get. And it'll look something like this. This one shows a practice doing $1 million in revenue, because it's easy for us to look at the percentages that way. And then a bunch of costs. Staff costs in this practice are running 27%. The owner is paying themselves and their spouse $240,000 a year. And then you've got a bunch of normal costs. The rent and occupancy cost was effectively negotiated by Cirrus, and at $70,000 is right in line with an average practice at 7%. And then you can see a bunch of other costs there. But the key thing is your accountant has done this to make it look like you're making as little money as possible, because the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. So you're paying your accountant to make you look unprofitable. You're paying a brokerage firm to try to make you look, well, to fairly and accurately represent the profitability of the business. So this shows you how we would tackle that financial statement that you can see a moment ago showed this person making $141,000. Well, the first thing we do is we remove that $240,000 that they were paying themselves and their spouse, because that's an arbitrary number. The rent and occupancy costs, supplies, lab costs, those are all very real hard numbers. A new owner of this practice will have those costs. But then you'll see we took out the auto expense. Those of you who own practices and employ associates, you're not paying for their car. The associates out there, I'm sure you're not being paid, nor is the principal dentist paying for your meals and entertainment, your attendance at conventions, education, your provincial license, etc. So we zero out things that are either things an owner put in there, like their car expense to reduce their taxes, or are a cost of being a dentist rather than a cost of owning a practice, like an associate or your association fees in your province and your regulatory fees in your province. We zero out amortization because it's a non-cash expense. And if a practice had interest, and I'll go back for a second, this practice, he still owed a fare, or she still owed, it must have been a guy, they still owed a lot of money, $30,000, but that's not a cost the purchaser will have, they'll have their own interest. So when all is said and done, the practice now is showing costs of only $520,000. So the dentist is actually making about $480,000. But the principle in business appraisal is you've got to pay the owner to be the producer in the practice at a fair market rate. And what's left over after that is the money that's used to value the business. So in this case, the owner was doing 630 grand in dental billings. We pay 40% on that. And the resulting adjusted EBITDA is $228,000. So think of it as strip all the stuff out that your accountant puts in to make you look less profitable, including whatever you paid yourself and your spouse. Add in a fair market wage for yourself as if you were an associate in your own practice. That's pretty much what the EBITDA is. Now, so this, I've just made the example a little bit simpler on the right. Let's skip that one. This is how the value of the practice is determined. It is that EBITDA times an earnings multiple. This example shows a 6 times earnings multiple. That is still a very achievable number in most major urban settings across Canada. In more remote areas, you may be down at a 5 times earnings multiple. The key thing is that you can't impact the earnings multiple you're going to sell for. That's determined by the market. What you can impact is your earnings. And because those earnings drive the value, that's where to focus your effort to build your value. It also, and I'm going to jump ahead here, if you have to pay the landlord to solve some of the problems that you may have in your lease, that is often a very smart thing to do. Eric, if this is a 15,000 square foot practice and they have to pay the landlord $4 more a square foot to get a better outcome with their lease, what's that going to cost them a year?
Negligible to the annual P&L.
Yeah,
right?
like $4,000 on, or $4 a square foot on 1,500 square feet. You're looking at $6,000.
Yep.
And if the practice is valued at 6 times earnings, yeah, the value drops by $6,000 times 6, or $36,000. But the examples I'm about to show you about the benefits of getting demolition clauses deferred or term extended are worth hundreds of thousands, not tens of thousands of dollars. Now, before I go any further, I do want to point this slide out to everybody on the call, because more than once I've received a phone call from a dentist saying, Bill, I went and heard somebody's talk. It wasn't you, but I heard somebody talk and I was told I needed at least 10 to 15 years of tenancy certainty. So I've just signed another 10-year lease. And I've gone, great, doctor, tell me more about your practice. And the doctor's gone on to say, well, I'm not working it so hard anymore, Bill. I've probably got less than 1,000 patients. I'm billing about 600,000 a year. Oh, doctor, what's your rent costing you? Oh, it's about 80 grand a year. How many new patients do you have coming? Well, probably not very many, 4 a month. A practice like that is going to be more valuable if the dentist can sell their patient base rather than the practice. But if the dentist has just signed on to another 10-year lease, somebody, either the purchaser of the patient base or the dentist, owes the landlord another 10 years of rent. Conversely, you might have the situation we discussed earlier. Eric mentioned somebody that's month to month on their lease or has 2 years left on their lease. In the absence of the landlord agreeing to extend it significantly, that person's selling their patient base too, whether they want to or not. So it's really important that you get a handle on your practice value, whether it's going to be more valuable in the sale of your patient base or the practice. If you've got lots of term on your lease and the lease is a good lease and you've got more than 1,000 patients coming annually, and you've got good new patient flow, you're almost certainly going to be able to sell the practice for significantly more than the patient base. But if your practice is in slow decline and you got less than 1,000 patients and can't show a purchaser that they can drive that number up, you may be selling the patient base. And boy, you better know that before you do your next lease negotiation. So let's talk about how it impacts your business. You all know out there that banks are not charitable institutions.
What?
When they when
I
they
would,
loan
I would
you,
add, we do have the Q&A open, so we'll certainly have some sections afterwards, but while it's top of mind, feel free to add the Q&A as we go.
and if I get one, I won't be tracking it. If I get one that's germane to what I'm talking about,
Yeah, I'll jump in for you, though.
you've never been shy to interrupt me in the past, which is great. So the bank, if they loan you money, expects to get paid back. And generally, they want enough tenancy certainty to cover the standard loan repayment period, which is 12 years. So if you have less than 12 years left on your lease between current term and renewal options, if you've got one of these demolition, renovation, or relocation clauses or other landlord termination rights, then there is potential issues getting bank financing. The bank wants certainty. Now, I say potential issues. We're selling practices right now, a practice right now where I've got 2 banks. There's only 9 years left on the lease. 4 years current term, 5-year renewal. It was the lease, Eric, you negotiated. You did the original one. The tenant did his renewal exercise on his own and could not get the landlord to tack another renewal on the back end. So he's got four left and 5. We're getting bank financing for that practice. So the buyers out there, just because there's not 12 years, I would definitely not suggest you walk away. What I would suggest is look carefully at what can be done and talk to your bank. And if your bank's not being helpful or cooperative, call me and I can steer you to a banker who will be. The banks generally will offer the same terms to everybody, but when it comes to this kind of thing, some are much better at dealing with it than others.
Rule of thumb is, again, if it's 9 years of term or 10 years of term, they'll do a 10-year amortization payback period, which just impacts how much that monthly payment is going to be for the potential buyer.
Right, and exactly. And on this practice I'm selling right now, we've got the bank to agree to do it over 12 years.
Great.
Two specific banks. And the rationale for the bank isn't that hard because banks, surprisingly, are in the business of loaning money. And if I went to the banker and said, look, zero demolition risk, this is a practice under a new condominium. Nobody's demolishing it anytime soon. And we pointed out to the bank that worst case scenario, if the owner has to move in 9 years, they've got 75% of their loan paid off, and the bank can loan them another $500,000, or by that point, probably 600,000 to relocate, and the bank will make more money. But that's got to be served up to the right banker in the right way. I've already talked about this. The cost to relocate even a 4-op practice could be 500,000 or more. Now, some of the folks out there who have a lease, and maybe you know you've got a demo clause and tuned in hoping to hear great news, or maybe you don't know. And if you don't know, odds are 20 to 25% of you do. I don't want you to lose sleep tonight, but odds are there are demo clauses lurking out there. This is what every practice owner with a demo clause has said to me. Everyone. Well, look, Bill, I've talked to the landlord. He's told me there's no way they're going to use the demolition or that renovation clause. They've got no plans to redevelop even well out into the future. So this really, I can see why it'd be an issue in a little plaza where the other 4 corners of the intersection have condos going up, but that's not me. And every practice buyer ever has responded to that rationale by saying, hey, great, that is just what I wanted to hear. So the landlord's going to have no problem removing that demolition clause from the lease then, right? Eric, how often have you seen a landlord agree to fully remove a demo clause from a lease?
I had a good chuckle when I saw this one. That's the usual dance. And look, we've got a good track record, but more often than not, the landlord's going to want to keep it there and keep it their options open to themselves, right? They want it there just because they can, is the most.
Right. And they've got no incentive to give it up. They're
Correct.
not in the business of making the dentist tenant happy. They're in the business of maximizing the return on their real estate investment. So let me show you what we do when we run into a demo clause or a relocation clause that's not a landlord expense. And for the buyers out there, you can look at it this way. Not all brokerages are dealing with demo clauses the way we are. And therefore, not all brokerages are getting practices sold that have them. So long as we price in the cost of relocating the practice, we find we can sell the practices. So if you're a buyer, just factor in the cost of maybe needing to relocate. Odds are on your side. The probability the landlord's going to exercise the demolition clause in many cases isn't that high. And you can generally negotiate a price that reflects almost a certainty they will. So this is an eye test, and I don't want you to focus on this at all. This is simply to illustrate that I said earlier, earnings multiples are a little simplistic. We actually do a 10-year forecast of earnings for every practice that we're selling. We actually do 12, but 12 doesn't fit easily on a page, so we show 10. But you can see on this line, sort of up from where it says discounted cash flow and earnings multiple, I highlighted in blue cash flow or EBITDA. So that's there. It's really important for a buyer to know they can repay their bank loan, or for when we're selling a practice, us to be able to show them they can repay it. So this is a real example. It is a client that Eric is negotiating on behalf of right now, because they've got a demo clause. Now, if they didn't have a demo clause, this practice would be worth $1.9 million. And that, if somebody buys the practice, spends $1.9 million, gets the forecast we put in, which does not assume a hockey stick, it just assumes business continuing as it is. The owner gets a 16% annual return on investment, and it would sell for effectively a 6.2 times earnings multiple. Pretty standard major urban practice. You can see, though, that at today's interest rates, the cash flow coming out of this practice, and to make this easier, I'm just going to go to this slide, which just shows you 6 years. The cash flow coming out of this practice after the owners paid themselves 40% to be the dentist is $285,000 in year one. A loan of $1.9 million at 6.95% interest rate, which is what the rate is today for purchasers, amortized over 12 years, requires a first year repayment of $286,000. So literally the owner has to reach into their pocket, come up with another $647. It gets better in year two because we're forecasting a drop in interest rates, but it is still really tight. And this is the key principle to understand. The way practices are being bid up these days drives the price right to the maximum a buyer can afford to repay with the cash flow coming out of the practice. So, you know, this would sell for $1.9 million. I'd be very confident in that. It's a good practice. But that is only if there's certainty. What if that practice has to relocate in the first year because they've got a demo clause? Well, the potential cost to relocate this would be $525,000. That's $350 a square foot on 1,500 square feet. So if the cash flow out of the practice only supports a loan of $1.9 million, and the bank may have to loan the purchaser over 500 grand to relocate in the next year, the bank's only giving the purchaser $1,380,000 now. The value of the practice is dropped by 525 grand. Plus, every buyer is going to worry about their ability to find suitable space in the area, the complexity of managing a move, the risk of patient attrition, and the overall hassle of this. So in this example, we would struggle to get the vendor $1.4 million, which is why I introduced them to Eric. Because if Eric can get that demo clause deferred 10 years, there's a chance we're up close to $1.9 million, probably $1.8 million to $1.9 million. But if he can get it deferred 5 years, we can get this owner about $1.6 million, $1.633 million is the number here. Because what we do is factor in that cost that today it's 550 grand with inflation, or sorry, today it's 525 grand. In 5 years, that relocation cost will go up. That just, the 568 you see there is just the inflated cost 5 years from now. And then down below, you can see the loan repayment schedule. If the bank has to loan the buyer 568 grand to relocate the practice, and the buyer is going to pay that off over the remaining time in the initial 12-year term, it can work, but the value of the practice drops significantly, but not as much. So if I were to summarize those, with the landlord having no termination rights, practice is worth $1.9 million. With the 5-year deferral, it's worth about $1.6 million. With the termination right now, it's worth probably under $1.35 million. So a simple 5-year deferral, if Eric can get it for this guy, and we don't know that he can yet, Eric, you can update me if you know tonight, but if he can, is going to improve this doctor's personal net worth by $300,000. And if he's structured right, that's $300,000 after tax. So it's absolutely of critical importance. You understand what is in your lease. If you're buying a practice and there is a demo clause, I personally would not want to buy a practice with the demo clause in effect today. You've got to look carefully at the wording. If it's a true standalone demolition clause and it's a new building, that's not that big a concern. If it's the far more pernicious and common demolition or substantial renovation clause, there is no legal definition of substantial renovation. And if I, the landlord, can find somebody to rent the entire floor you're on from me at $3 a square foot premium, I'm substantially renovating to get you out of there. So look carefully at the clause. I like to say that demolition versus renovation clauses are kind of like pigs and chickens when it comes to breakfast. A chicken is involved, but the pig is firmly committed. A bacon and egg breakfast, obviously. A landlord has to be pretty committed to exercise a demolition clause, but not the pernicious renovation clause. So just to wrap up, and we'll throw it out to questions, lease assignment, Eric touched on this. Here's the way I want everyone with the lease to think about it. You need your landlord's permission to sell your practice. It's that simple. None of you probably think there's no friggin' way the landlord should be able to block it. But hopefully that clause is worded that permission cannot be unreasonably withheld. And it's reasonable to the landlord to say, hey, wait, you can't sell to somebody else because you contracted with me. And I trust you. You've always paid your rent. You've got a tremendous track record. You want to sell it to some kid 2 years out of dental school who still owes $300,000 in student loans and is going to go $1.8 million into debt to buy this practice? That's too big a risk for me. So that
I
assignment,
would just add to that, Bill,
yeah,
right? Not unreasonably withhold, but don't forget, we also don't want the landlord to be able to delay and or condition the sale by
right.
increasing rent, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And the rest of this you've covered. And
Bill, when you say, sorry, go back one, Bill.
yeah,
One question I'm sure is going to pop up is you will likely have to pay your landlord to get that permission. What do you mean by that? Or what examples have you seen lately?
I've seen everything from an old lease where the cost of lease assignment was $500 to the tenant will cover all reasonable expenses incurred by the landlord in processing the assignment request. And as you'd said earlier, I've seen landlords say that their reasonable expenses, including the risk they are incurring, is 5 to 10% of the selling price of the practice. So it is really important that you look at your assignment provision and you do your very best, or wisely engage Eric and his team to do their very best to manage that as much in advance as you can. It doesn't mean that every lease assignment you're going to get hosed by your landlord. Many go through just fine. But the fact that many go through just fine is a statement about what happens on average. And not one of you is average. You're a single individual landlord decision. So when you go to renegotiate terms in your lease, you definitely want to be looking not just at the things Eric's, the demolition, the relocation, the renovation clauses, but also that assignment provision. And the reason you might want to talk to Eric is get your lease reviewed by professionals. When we do a practice appraisal, we do a lease review. We don't pretend to be anywhere near close to Eric and his team, but we're able to spot the word demolition, renovation, and we're able to look at assignment provisions and refer you on to the experts to deal with them. So that was it. Do we have any questions that have appeared, Eric?
Let me check. Yeah, Bill, what's one question from Dr. M? I'm planning to sell in roughly 5 years. What are steps I can take today in order to properly prepare for a smooth sale?
I love that question. If Dr. M, you've got you're in leased premises, definitely you want to get your lease reviewed very carefully. I generally tell people that 5 to 10 years before you're going to sell, it makes a whole lot of sense to get a proper practice appraisal done. Because we can look at your practice and identify what value you have created, what you've done to create that value, and what you could do to unlock a lot more value. And that won't be the same in every practice. And so having somebody look at your practice through the eyes of the eventual sale to identify where the strengths are, where the opportunities are. You know, an appraisal, depending upon who you go with, is going to cost you $4,900 plus. It is very rare that 5 years out in advance, we're not able to identify opportunities to increase value hundreds of thousands. And, you know, the basic areas that we look at, we bench, the number one thing all of you can do to strengthen your practice value, and it's also the number 2 and the number 3 thing, is build your hygiene program. But if you don't know how your hygiene program benchmarks to all the other hygiene programs buyers are looking at, you don't know where you're starting from. Insourcing things you're currently outsourcing, such as bringing clear aligners into the practice, making crowns in-house, 3D printing night guards, to the extent you're comfortable with those as things you would want to do, will all build your value considerably, potentially. Getting your supply costs down, going to your dental supply rep and saying, how can you save me money? I sold my business to Henry Schein, so I know what they do. they can run a report called a product substitution report that can show you how you could be saving money by using various house brand products that are made by the same name brand manufacturers. And then looking at your new patient flow, looking at your patient attrition, those are all things we study when we do an appraisal. And the old saying, it's hard to get where you're going if you don't know where you're starting from. 5 years out, I'd get an appraisal done, if not by us, by somebody who will look at those things, make sure they're going to tell you how to build the value. Then you've got a game plan for the next 5 years.
Perfect. A few more, Bill, that have come through. One, actually, Bill, I'm going to give this one to you. You've seen the aftermath of leases negotiated by brokers, lawyers. The question here is, having a lease reviewed by a local lawyer versus Cirrus different?
Yes. Oh my God, I'm so glad somebody asked that. I am dealing with 2 different leases situations right now. And one person, it's the situation you were describing earlier. She has a practice that would probably be worth about $4 million. She signed a lease renewal, having had her lawyer review it, about 6 months before she called me. And in that lease renewal was a demolition provision. Right out of the gate, she signed that, her practice value dropped. Hey, this is a big practice, so it's a lot bigger than 1,500 square feet. The day she signed that lease, the value of her practice dropped by probably about $700,000 would be her relocation cost. She had no idea. She was trusting her lawyer. So yeah, the issue is that what makes people who do dental different than everyone else is we know the incredible cost of relocating a dental office. When I owned Tier 3, I had a demo clause in my lease and it never bothered me because the cost to relocate a brokerage operation was a bunch of boxes and a moving truck. And I could do it, I could find new office space in a month and my cost of relocation was going to be under 50 grand. What makes dentistry unique is there is no other business where cost to build out new space is as high as yours. And therefore, I would always get somebody who understands dentistry to look at the lease. You should, Eric, mention a couple other things that you guys routinely point out and get in leases that a non-dental lawyer wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm obviously a little biased, but the difference is, as Bill mentioned, is this is all we do is look at dental office leases all day, every day. And quite frankly, a lot of the lawyers, Michael Kuttner's a great example, will refer the leasing work to us because he knows it's a 30 to 40, 50 hour type process. He knows we've already got 2 or 3 other negotiations going on with the big national landlord, and that there's a lot of efficiencies with our specialization, number one. Number two is we have all the commercial real estate data, rental rates, vacancies, comp reports. We have the other 6 or 8 dentists that are within a drive and a putt from where your practice is today. So yes, I mean, look, hey, if you're asking about reviewing the lease, do the Coke challenge, right? Review it, get your notes from your local lawyer, right? Hopefully they don't charge you for it. Number 2, have us do an analysis of your lease and compare, right? See who covers more and see who is more thorough in terms of the dental specific issues within your lease. That's a great one. Bill, another couple, and we'll keep this open again I know we're a little late on the East Coast, but we'll cover through. Bill, anonymous, have you or do you plan on evaluating and helping buy, sell hygiene clinics?
Yep, we've valued and sold hygiene clinics. We don't work for buyers. Nobody in the brokerage business does. Buyers, you'll want to just establish a great relationship with an accountant who knows dentistry. It's the same comment I made a moment ago about lawyers. Your accountant that was your dad's golfing buddy or your cousin can do a great job on your taxes if you're associating today, but they're not the person you want advising you on a dental practice purchase where you're going $1 million, 2 million, 4 million into debt. Get an expert advising you. Hygiene practices aren't generally 2 to 4 million in value, but yeah, we do appraise and sell hygiene clinics. Surprisingly, often hygiene clinics sell to a dentist, but not always.
The follow-up question, I believe, to the first was typically what's the appropriate time frame to have leases reviewed? I mean, the sweet spot to start lease negotiations are typically 2.5 years prior to the lease expiry or the option to renew deadline. In terms of if you're asking how long would it take us to review it, well, obviously emailing us at info@siriusconsultinggroup.com, send a copy of your original lease, any amendments, riders, exhibits, assignments that you've signed along the way, all the way back to the original seller 3 or 4 sellers ago, back to 1986, to wherever the governing document is. But typically for us, usually we're about 2 to 3 business days, depending on the complexity of the lease, etc.
And just let me add to that. It's probably self-evident to most people on the call, but it comes up all the time. The last time you want to have your lease reviewed and maybe need it to be renegotiated is just before you sell. And this happens far more frequently. Well, I just mentioned the woman who just signed a new lease renewal 6 months ago, and we're going to send her back to her landlord trying to get some changes. But Eric, if you show up on a landlord's doorstep days or months or even a year or two after the tenant signed a 5-year term, what does the landlord know and how does that cause them to behave?
The challenge is, with no runway, you lose your leverage fast. The second the landlord knows that you're thinking of you're on your way out, right? Instantly, the landlord's not thinking about you. They're thinking about protecting their investment and how the heck can they try to make sure that they're not going to get stuck when you leave. So, and look, we've had issues where, certain real estate brokers that are getting paid the commission of a percentage of whatever you're paying, one locked the doctor in for a 15-year term. It takes away any leverage for the landlord to want to open up the lease. Every 5 years that lease renews, it's a reset button. In many cases, we advise not exercising your option. Much better to negotiate a new 5 or a 10-year term, as Bill mentioned, and keep those 2 5-year options for your future buyer. Keep that for Bill to be able to structure a nice long-term warm blanket around that buyer and their bank to make sure that they've got that throughout the whole process. So that's a big one. We've got a couple more, Bill, so I'll just run through these quickly. Given that the buyer pays for leasehold improvements as part of the practice value, is there a difference in lease rates of a conventional office space versus dental office, aka are dental office leases higher than normal office space leases in the same area? That's asking a couple of questions. One is on the rent side, but Bill, maybe to the first piece, it's interesting, right? Because part of the practice valuation is obviously the beautiful practice, but the leasehold improvements technically are owned by the landlord, right? And in some cases, the buyer might even have to return it to pre-dental condition. Any specifics about leaseholds? And then I can address the rental question shortly after.
No, I think you nailed it there. You don't, as the owner of the practice, own the leaseholds. You've got the right to use them for as long as your lease allows you to. But in the end, they're going to revert to the landlord. And yeah, a practice with beautiful leaseholds that people walk into and go, oh, I love this place. That's going to attract more patients and therefore be more valuable. And a purchaser will go, I can see spending the rest of my career here. So nice leaseholds help, but they don't change the EBITDA and the earnings in the practice unless they're doing so through patient loyalty. I'm interested in what you're going to say about the rental rate for dental space.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. Conventional office space versus dental space is the question. So in short, it depends, right? So on the one side, you're the best tenant on the planet. You've got the highest build-out costs. You've got the lowest default rates at 0.5%. You're in the same location for 26.5 years. And you're COVID-proof. You can't work from home, and you still consistently bring in high-quality foot traffic. right? Including Bill and I to come in and get a cleaning. With that being said, it depends on who negotiated it. Is it someone that negotiated that was getting a percentage of your total spend? If so, did you get a bunch of tenant improvement allowance from the landlord when the clinic was originally built out? We know the landlords are not in the lending business. So if they gave the original builder of the practice $50,000 or $100,000 or 10 or 30 or $50 per square foot, right? Well, typically that's just built into the rent. So by and large, the short answer is yes. Doctors that might have taken a bigger tenant improvement allowance took a much higher than initial market rate, and that increased at 3, 4, 5%. Yes, we do run into scenarios. We helped a client recently on the West Coast cut her rent in half because of the fact that the original doctor had built in a whole bunch, paid the much higher rate. And even as it renewed every 5 years, it was the world's most boring roller coaster. It just kept on going up and up and up. So yes, we do see, unfortunately, that dentists are paying more, which is why we're there to renegotiate base rents, annual increases, common area maintenance, fixturing, free rent, tenant improvement allowance, landlord work, et cetera, just to name a few. Okay, Bill, back on the hygiene clinic. This is to build a brand new hygiene clinic, looking at a new lease with the commercial landlord, and would like to know to what extent this comparable to dental clinic costs, and how much time it would take to request from the landlord to review these terms. So
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I think it's more of a build question than a sell question. So
okay. The landlord, if the question is about the cost to build out hygiene space, you're going to save a little bit of money, but not a lot. And it depends a lot on where you are in the country and whether the hygienist can take radiographs in their practice. Because lead lining your walls, which is pretty standard now in most provinces, adds to the cost. I would do that either way, though, because it gives that facility more flexibility going forward. And the reason dental and hygiene leasehold improvement costs are so high is it's not unique to dentistry versus hygiene, because you're running all the electrical into the operatories, you're running water into the operatories, you're running suction out of the operatories. It's all of that stuff that drives the costs up compared to an office where you're running an electrical cord into it. So I don't think you're going to save a lot building out a hygiene space instead of a dental space, if that is what the question was.
Yeah, I believe so. And then the question is, how much time does it take to review the form with the landlord? Negotiations on new deals, to get them right, they're not fast. Landlords can be very slow, but that's because they're used to slow, delay, etc. And that's usually one of the main ways they win. We work on a flat rate basis. Landlords know we don't go away, and we stick it out as long as it takes until we get the proper wins that we know are fair. So in this case, again, typically that could be a 90-day process to negotiate that with a landlord. But don't forget, you're locking your clinic in, hygiene clinic, dental clinic, etc., in for what could be 26.5 years. It is the largest check that you will sign to any personal or professional entity, bar none. This is a good one that we touched on a little bit before. I've heard I should put a lease in place even though I own the space. Is this the only benefit when I go to sell the practice, or I plan to retain the space following the practice sale? So at a high level, I've recently done a similar course with the accountants, and the accountants will say, are you required to have one by law? No. But in the strongest ways that the accountants can advise, that you should definitely have a lease in place. And they do that for a few reasons. One is for a tax and audit perspective, right? Accountants love to make sure that in an audit, great, here's all the supporting documentation. Here's the lease we signed in 2014. Here it is based on market price. Here's to substantiate the market price at the time, and we've been increasing at 4% per year, and we've been treating it as a non-arm's length lease. right? Because obviously owners paying from one pocket to the other to the detriment of Ottawa creates a major CRA red flag. So tax and audit, the accountants by and large strongly suggest to have a proper lease between the two and to make sure that you're following it. Other pieces there, right, are the liability side, right? Who's responsible for what? If you own the building personally and the practice in a corporation or them both in the same corporation, right? That's the deep well theory, and lawyers love to go after all sorts of stuff, slips and falls, etc. The other piece that can become important are those doctors that want to potentially keep the building as a passive form of income post-sale. And having advised lots of buyers, it becomes even psychologically for the buyer, the fact that I've said, look, this is the lease I've had in place for the past 5, 6, 7 years. These are the clean set of financials that my accountant has done. I'm paying myself the same way that I would want to charge my future buyer a triple net lease, right? Plus taxes, maintenance, insurance. And now I'm just transferring that lease on to the buyer. I won't speak on Bill's side, but certainly when we advise the buyers, right, it's a lot less leverage to go back when considering they've designed this to be dental specific, right? It's the same way that they've done exactly the billings, because look, we see it all the time. If the if the ink is wet on the lease that they've just created and is very different from how they've been paying themselves in the past, right? If I was advising the buyer, it does create some doubt and concern. So hopefully that answers that at a high level. It's important to at least know. And again, the bigger piece is we had a great video recently from a doctor Midtown Toronto who gets his practice valued bill from your firm usually every 5 years. He has us update the lease to separate as two different corporations. He wants his building to go to his kids. The interesting part here, though, is that he puts this as well as your valuation bill and our lease into the folder and puts it in the event of death open here. Because he knows here's Bill's card, here's Eric's card, transfer the lease. Here's exactly how I've been paying myself, sell it tomorrow, because every day that passes post your untimely passing can dramatically impact the practice value. One other piece, Bill, I saw a slide shared that if
I know what dentist you're talking about, by the way.
I know you do. He's a heck of a guy. I saw a slide that shared that you sublease, subtenant, and operatory, then anything above and beyond the lease rate is payable to the landlord. Would this not justify the cost of TI improvements on our end? We're talking about a few different things there. That might be a good one to take offline, or happy to look at your particular lease. There are landlords now that deem that if you do have a T4A independent contractor, an OMS, a ortho, endo, perio, pros that comes in once or twice a month, some landlords are deeming that to be actually a subtenant and using that either A, to hold you in default, or B, more likely just to increase rent when they see all these other doctor names on the doors. Number one. Number two is there's the consideration language. So yes, if you are now getting money beyond if you are profiting or doing a revenue split with the doctor, or the doctor's paying you a flat rate to use your space, then yes, that is very much the definition of a subtenant, which your lease will not allow you to do without the landlord's prior written approval. So hopefully that answers the first two questions. Would this not justify the cost of TI improvements on our end? I'm not sure I'm clear on that part of the question. But it is important that if you are bringing in outside entities, does your lease allow for that? And how do you help to make sure that, again, your lease has dental specific language? We've created something called an associates clause that basically states you can bring in T4A independent contractors to your space, operate under the use provision of general dentistry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Yet not be deemed to increase rent, nor to be in default of your lease, or to be considered as a subtenant. Back to the lawyer versus Cirrus, et cetera. I mean, we've only realized that after doing it for 30 years and seeing when the proverbial crap hits the fan, we've typically been the company that gets the call. So we've amassed this sort of Iron Man suit of best practice in intellectual property over the past, years with the roughly 20,000 leases we have on file. On that note, Bill, the 300 square foot cost plus having a sublease to repay these costs. So I think the question was, what are the redevelopment costs, etc., in comparison? So yeah, in those cases, it's just really risk from the buyer's perspective to look at it that way. But yes, great questions. Dr. Harris, hopefully that answered your one question. To the others, hopefully that answered yours as well. Bill, we've gone 30 minutes over. Thank you so much for your additional time. I know you've got lots going on and lots of key meetings at head office this week, but truly appreciate it, Bill. This is, again, I shudder every time I talk to a doctor and they say, oh my gosh, I only wish I talked to you before I just signed this. I only wish. Right? I structured my lease before I needed to sell.
It happens weekly to me. And so thank you all for your attendance. While we went over, hopefully it was valuable. I see that we've got virtually everyone who started with us is still with us. And I know I'm speaking for Eric when I say, if you've got questions about your own specific situation, you can reach out to either of us. In my case, I'll make sure we've got one of our great team members in your area follow up with you. Eric's got great team people right across North America. And your practice is either the biggest asset and most important asset you own, or the second one after your house. And the lease is critical to the value of your practice. And I just shake my head in sadness on, honestly, like I've had 4 or 5 calls this year already from, or 4 and practices we're doing where there were demo clauses and people didn't know. Right, not demo. That demo's the pig. It's the chicken I worry about. It's that substantial reno clause. So folks, this is really important stuff. It is your personal net worth or the money you're leaving behind for your kids. Don't leave it to chance is my impassioned plea to you.
Yeah, and what's devastating for both Bill and I is when a doctor says, well, God, I'll pay the landlord $100,000 to get rid of it. I mean, it's just, if I can get Bill to sell it for an extra $5 and it costs me an extra $100, who do I need to pay? And unfortunately, in comparison to a redevelopment $44 million check, it's a rounding error. So the solution is be proactive investment versus reactive cost. Have your practice valued and valued often as part of your wills and succession planning, and definitely have your lease reviewed for risks and get it properly renegotiated while you've got plenty of runway before the eventual sale, because it is incredibly difficult upon Bill about to sell the clinic and suddenly, whoops, let's go back to the landlord and roll the dice. Right? It is far easier to do early and often. So thank you so much for everyone. Bill, thank you, sir. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Issues aside.
Well, we got it worked out in the end.
Indeed. And we look forward to working with each of you. And again, you're not alone out there, guys. It's the last thing people want to think of is leases and values, etc. But the small little things you do today on the accounting side, practice value, and lease side, I can assure you can make the difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, upon your eventual sale and transition. On that note, God bless. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you, Bill.